In the early years of the Cold War, when the world's nerves were still raw from the shock of World War II, the Korean Peninsula became the stage for a confrontation that neither side believed would consume so much of the planet's attention. The Korean War began suddenly, violently, and with a speed that shattered illusions about the stability of a post-war world. And in the center of that storm stood two American generals whose visions of war could not have been more different. One believed the United States had a historic duty to seize initiative, shatter communism's advance, and reshape the future of Asia with bold strokes. The other believed America's responsibility was something quieter, heavier, and far more complicated: to prevent the next World War. Their names were Douglas MacArthur and Omar Bradley, and the conflict between them would become one of the most consequential disagreements in U.S. military history. It was a conflict not only of strategy, but of worldview, character, and the terrifying new realities of nuclear power. When American troops first rushed to Korea in 1950, the mission was simple: halt the North Korean invasion. Few imagined the war would soon spiral into a debate over whether to invade China, bomb its cities, blockade its coast, or risk triggering a global confrontation with the Soviet Union. Even fewer imagined that one of America's most celebrated military heroes would stand on one side of this confrontation, and the quiet, analytical general, known as the soldier's soldier, would stand firmly on the other. MacArthur had been a giant long before Korea. His legend stretched from the trenches of World War I to the islands of World War II and into the reconstruction of Japan. He spoke in sweeping historical arcs, framed military operations as destiny, and commanded not just armies, but imaginations. Many Americans saw him as a modern Caesar, brilliant, decisive, and certain. To MacArthur, Korea was not an isolated flashpoint. It was merely the opening battle in a far larger struggle for control of Asia. And in his view, the United States was fighting the wrong enemy. Bradley, meanwhile, was cut from a different cloth. He had commanded millions of soldiers in North Africa and Europe, yet carried none of the flamboyance that made MacArthur a household name. He favored logic over spectacle, caution over risk, and quiet persuasion over headlines. He understood the weight of war in human lives and logistical burdens, and as chairman of the Joint Chiefs, he had a responsibility that extended beyond any single battlefield. He had to consider all the potential fires a single spark could ignite.
The tension between these two men grew gradually, then suddenly. After the stunning success of MacArthur's Incheon landing, which threw North Korea's army into disarray, MacArthur saw opportunity everywhere. He urged Washington to approve a full push northward. He dismissed Chinese warnings as empty threats and believed that if the United States moved quickly, it could reunify Korea under a friendly government and deliver a staggering blow to communist ambition in Asia. To him, the war had presented a perfect moment to strike not just a localized victory, but a decisive strategic blow. Bradley saw the situation through different lenses. Intelligence reports suggested Chinese forces were mobilizing in massive numbers. Reconnaissance flights reported new troop concentrations in Manchuria. Diplomatic channels indicated rising panic in Beijing. Yet from his headquarters in Tokyo, MacArthur waved aside these concerns. He insisted China would not dare to intervene, and if it did, the United States could crush its forces easily. The difference between the two generals was not simply a disagreement in analysis. It was a divergence in how they viewed risk itself. As American troops approached the Yalu River, reality struck with brutal force. Chinese soldiers poured into Korea by the tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands. They attacked in waves, employing tactics that overwhelmed American lines, driving United Nations forces into one of the harshest retreats of the war. What MacArthur had believed impossible was suddenly undeniable. China had entered the conflict with devastating strength. In Washington, Bradley watched the situation deteriorate with growing alarm. It was clear the war had now changed shape. China was not merely supporting North Korea, it had taken command of the fight. To MacArthur, this shift meant the mask had finally been dropped. He argued the United States must now confront China openly. He demanded permission to bomb Chinese supply bases across the border, blockade its coast, and arm nationalist forces in Taiwan to open a second front. He believed stopping now would be surrender disguised as caution. But Bradley saw disaster forming underneath MacArthur's proposals. Bombing China risked drawing the Soviet Union into the conflict. A blockade meant war with Chinese forces beyond Korea's borders. And expanding operations into mainland Asia with winter closing in, supply lines stretched thin, and Europe unsteady was a recipe for global escalation. The Korean War had begun as a regional defense effort. MacArthur sought to transform it into a crusade. But in the nuclear age, crusades could ignite infernos no one could extinguish. Bradley's fears were not abstract. He had seen war up close, and he knew what global conflict would mean now that atomic weapons existed. The Soviet Union had detonated its first nuclear device the previous year. Europe was divided, rearming, rebuilding, and vulnerable. To widen the Korean War into a U.S.-China war was, in his eyes, to gamble not just the lives of soldiers, but the stability of the entire world. The break between the two generals widened as MacArthur sent dramatic public statements criticizing U.S. policy, undermining diplomatic efforts, and calling for escalation. He spoke as though the war was his to shape alone. Washington insisted its goal was limited: defend Korea, maintain boundaries, and avoid a global conflict. MacArthur insisted the United States must seize the moment to crush communist power across Asia.
For Bradley, this was not boldness, it was recklessness. He believed that leadership in the Cold War demanded something far rarer than aggressive action. It demanded restraint. The world had changed since the age of total war. A miscalculation could now wipe out cities in seconds, and the responsibility to prevent such destruction was as heavy as the responsibility to defeat aggression. So when MacArthur formally submitted his plan to escalate the war, the Joint Chiefs reviewed it with cold, unblinking focus. They examined logistics, alliances, intelligence, the Soviet situation, global commitments, and nuclear realities. Then Bradley delivered the judgment that captured the essence of their analysis. He declared MacArthur's plan to be the wrong war, at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy. It was more than a criticism, it was a strategic verdict. China was a continental power with immense manpower reserves. Korea was a harsh battleground that punished attackers. The timing was disastrous, with Europe fragile and tensions high across the globe. And the enemy MacArthur wanted to fight, Communist China, was not the enemy the United States had entered Korea to confront. Bradley's words were born from the understanding that the Korean War existed in a world where any wrong move could spiral beyond all control. He understood that losing Korea would be a setback, but escalating into a world war could be irreversible. He believed the United States must choose battles with precision, not passion. And a war against China in that moment, under those conditions, with those risks, was simply untenable. MacArthur rejected that logic. He saw the conflict as a grand moral struggle, one in which hesitation was indistinguishable from surrender. As he continued to push for expanded authority and publicly challenge official policy, the clash with Washington became inevitable. Finally, President Truman relieved him of command. It was one of the most controversial decisions in American history. MacArthur returned home to parades and applause, a hero to millions who believed he had been punished for speaking the truth. Yet inside military and political circles, Bradley's perspective prevailed. The United States continued the war with limited aims. It sought to restore boundaries, not redraw them. It refused to provoke the Soviet Union. It avoided bombing China's cities.
and though the war remained brutal and often frustrating, it did not become the global catastrophe many feared. The front lines hardened into a stalemate. Negotiations dragged. Lives were lost, but the world did not burn. The Soviet Union did not send armies into Europe. Nuclear weapons did not devastate cities. The superpower confrontation remained contained, frightening, but survivable. In the harsh logic of global strategy, preventing the worst outcome was, in its own way, a monumental success. In later years, historians would reflect on the clash between MacArthur and Bradley as more than a military dispute. It was a struggle over how to lead in a nuclear world. MacArthur represented the heroic age of war, sweeping offensives, decisive battles, the belief that victory could reshape civilizations. Bradley represented the new age, one in which war had to be managed, limited, controlled, because total victory was no longer possible without risking total destruction. Bradley's quiet warning became one of the defining statements of Cold War strategy. He understood that force alone could not steer the world away from disaster. Strategy required balance, discipline, and the courage to say no to battles that could not be won without endangering the entire planet. His words stand not just as a critique of one general's plan, but as a reminder of the immense weight carried by those who must decide when nations go to war.
The legacy of their clash still echoes through modern conflict. It shaped how the United States approached Vietnam, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and countless confrontations afterward. It taught leaders that power without restraint can be as dangerous as weakness, that the greatest threats may not always lie on the battlefield, but in the consequences that extend far beyond it, and that sometimes the most important victories are the disasters avoided, not the enemies defeated. As decades passed, the world came to understand how close humanity had stood to far greater peril. And in that understanding, Bradley's words gained new resonance. Wrong war, wrong place, wrong time, wrong enemy. A sentence that captured not only a moment in history, but a guiding principle for an age defined by the terrifying power of nuclear weapons. The Korean War ended without clear victory or defeat, leaving a scar across a divided peninsula. But the world endured. Nations rebuilt. The Cold War raged on, but the unimaginable did not occur. The decisions made during those tense months shaped a safer, if uneasy, future. And behind those decisions stood leaders like Bradley, who understood that in the nuclear age, wisdom could be as vital as courage, and restraint could be as heroic as any battlefield triumph.